Hello and welcome to the final session of ASM Live from the 2011 American Society for Microbiology meeting being held here in New Orleans. I'm Jeffrey Fox. I'm the features editor of Microbe, which is the monthly magazine of ASM, and your host for these sessions. And I do want to make a sad note that this is the last of our sessions, and not only are we going off the air, but so is Oprah this week. But we hope to be back next year, so that's a good something to look forward to. For those of you on the web who want to ask questions, please use hashtag ASM2011. And for those of you in the room who would like to ask questions, raise a hand, and someone will bring you a microphone. Identify yourself by name and institution, and we'll have a lively discussion. My guests for this final session are Stephen McGarvey of Brown University to my immediate left, and to his left, Graham Rook of University College London. We'll be talking about the hygiene hypothesis and some sort of broad epidemiologic findings about worldwide health trends. I'd like to invite my two guests one at a time, of course, to give a brief summary of their findings. And Graham, why don't we start with you, please?
Okay, well, it's lovely to be here. My interest recently has been why certain chronic inflammatory diseases are increasing at an enormous rate, or have increased at an enormous rate, starting in the mid-19th century and accelerating their rate of increase during the 20th century. And those diseases that I'm particularly concerned with are autoimmune disorders like type 1 diabetes and multiple sclerosis, allergic disorders like hay fever and asthma, and inflammatory bowel diseases. And we think that all of these diseases are disorders where there's a problem with the regulation of the immune system, and that has something to do, or at least in part, something to do with the changing microbial exposures that we get, which are no longer those for which we evolved, because we evolved as hunter-gatherers. So that's a short summary of what I have to say.
Steve.
And taking off from Professor Rook's notions, the broad changes in the types of disease over time by different types of income groups in the world, the developing world, the developed world, or low-income countries and high-income countries, has been a shift from infectious diseases to what we would consider chronic non-communicable diseases, the major ones being well known to us here in the US and the UK, obesity, diabetes, coronary artery disease, increasingly diseases of mental health. But the two topics that we represent here are connected because children begin to die less frequently of infectious diseases for a variety of reasons. And one of the reasons for that is they're less exposed to that. And so Professor Rook's ideas very much take advantage of these changes in behavior conditioned on socioeconomic situations that change the way people behave and how they make their life every day.
Okay. Why don't you give us a little bit more detail, Steve, about some of the trends you've just talked about succinctly? Are there some noteworthy curves in there that we ought to be aware of? And I'm kind of curious how it's not as if infectious diseases are disappearing for sure. We have, of course, many more vaccines to treat young children and so as to prevent diseases that were once much more prevalent. But there are, how does this size up, as you say, at a high altitude view of disease trends?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Very much what I talked about this morning was this sort of World Health Organization, really global picture of major trends. And those trends are quite clear that the conditions that are the non-communicable diseases that are very prevalent and cause morbidity and mortality in high-income countries are beginning to show up in very high levels in the middle-income countries, Brazil, Mexico, China, the low-income countries, even in sub-Saharan African nations and in South Asia. And this is because children are making it to their 5th birthday because of the vaccines and improvements in sanitation and hygiene. And so those major killers of children have been reduced quite a bit. And once you get a child to around 5 or 6 years of age, they're fairly hardy, and they make it through the next 20 or 30 years. And then it's those conditions in people's 40s and 50s that we're very interested in. And these low and middle income countries have been dedicated to saving children, which they've done a very good job at, but they're not built, their healthcare systems are not built for the chronic non-communicable conditions like hypertension, obesity, diabetes, that are related to our diet, our physical activity patterns, our tobacco exposure, our alcohol drinking, and other conditions. So the big message for your average person on the street who might be listening or watching is the diseases that are present in the US and the UK are already present in very high numbers in these middle-income countries, and they will become the major force of disease and mortality even in the low-income countries in the next 20 to 30 years.
Well, that's something of a frightening prospect in terms of the economic drain on those countries, in as much as we're having a really tough time with skyrocketing medical care costs.
When you find out that you have asthma or diabetes or high blood pressure or you have coronary artery disease, the course of medicine, the changes in behavior, the cost to the quality of life, the cost to the family and the community, and the cost to whoever's paying the bill medically are enormous. And that is what people are quite worried about.
Okay. Let's shift gears a bit, and you said something about we're no longer hunters and gatherers, but you're not, and it seems as if the people we thought might still be hunters and gatherers are no longer hunters and gatherers. So where are we headed? What do you really mean by saying that in terms of the microorganisms to which we're exposed or with which we cohabit? How is all of that changing our own personal health?
Well, it's the organisms with which we co-evolved, in effect. And of course, one of the big themes of this meeting has been the fact that we can't think of ourselves as some sort of plastic being that was dropped onto planet Earth. We are, in fact, a part of the biosphere, and we are mostly microbe anyway. We have far more microbes in our guts than we have cells in our body. And we co-evolved with these things, but the pattern of organisms with which we co-evolved is very different from that which we meet now. For instance, throughout the evolution of mammals and then of humans, there will always have been helminths in our systems, always. And helminths had to be tolerated because there's no, once you've got a helminth on board, you can't do anything about it.
And we should remind people who don't know that helminths are worms.
Helminths are worms.
We're talking about worms.
Parasitic worms, of which there are very many kinds. And the immune system has terrible trouble with things like helminths. So helminths are a very nice example to illustrate the principle here. Because since one has to tolerate the helminths have developed ways of turning on the regulatory mechanisms within the immune system. And for instance, somebody with microfilariae infection, if they don't turn on the regulatory mechanisms that turn off the worst parts of inflammation in their immune system, they completely destroy the lymphatic system. And everybody has seen these ghastly pictures of people with elephantiasis. So basically, normally when somebody has microfilariae, the immune system is told to get the police force ready and turn down the inflammatory response to a level where it's acceptable, trying to get a sort of balance with keeping the worms under control, but also not destroying your system. Now, what we think has happened is that over the hundreds of thousands, even millions of years, the role of organisms like those, and also in a big way the organisms in the gut, in turning on regulatory processes that stop the immune system from getting out of hand, that role has become, if you like, written into our genomes. So we can no longer do without those organisms. And if we don't meet those organisms, then the immune system's regulatory pathways are not functioning properly. And there's an enormous amount of data now to show that people who have things like multiple sclerosis, where the immune system is attacking the brain, or type 1 diabetes, where it's attacking the cells that make insulin, or people who have inflammatory bowel disease, where it's probably attacking the gut contents, or people with allergies who are attacking some trivial thing wafting past in the breeze or the neighbor's cat. In all these situations, these are all responses which should have been turned off. And they are turned off in people living in third world countries who have got worms, who've got the classic, the pattern of microbiota in the gut that we should have, but they are not being turned off correctly in the rich Western countries. So the whole subject has reached a very exciting stage because clinical trials are beginning to be done with some of the worms. The most exciting trial is one that's been done recently in patients with multiple sclerosis. We're giving them the pig whipworm, in fact the eggs of the pig whipworm. They sound unacceptable perhaps to many people, but you swallow the eggs of the pig whipworm, they hatch out in your gut. It's a transient infection because it's the pig whipworm, not the human whipworm. But that is sufficient to turn on various regulatory mechanisms. And it was a phase 1 trial, really, just to show safety. But the results are very provocative indeed. And so that's the sort of way it's going. Obviously, the future doesn't actually lie in giving everybody helminth infections. But if the principle is established, then one can start looking for the molecules that actually trigger the regulatory pathways, that get the policeman back in there to turn off unwanted immune responses.
So the epidemiologist says we all have to get sick and die of something. And with the improvements in the way of life that led to the reduction in some of these infectious diseases, the cost is we are an animal species that adapted to a very, very long sequence of time and generations, becoming adapted to these kinds of infections, to these kinds of microbes. Now that they're less frequent, in fact absent in very hygienic situations, there's a cost to pay. And that's what Professor Rooks is talking about as one of the costs. You don't get something for nothing in public health.
Right, and I was hoping I would be going to lunch, and now I have to think about having some worms for lunch. It's not that appetizing a thought, but I'm very intrigued by what you've just said. You said there's a phase 1 trial, and is that in the US or is that in the UK?
That was done in the US, John Fleming. And there are also trials with hookworm, believe it or not, taking place in the UK. They've done some very careful studies there working out what is the maximum number of hookworm that the good citizens of Nottingham can swallow without getting too much in the way of gastrointestinal symptoms. And having established that, now they are going into clinical trials again in allergic disorders and in multiple sclerosis. And of course there are already published trials in inflammatory bowel disease, in both ulcerative colitis and in Crohn's disease. Joel Weinstock is the leader of that group. So the thing is blossoming very fast, but of course it's not only going to be the parasitic worms that one can try to use in this way, or eventually, of course, molecules derived from them. There's also the whole question of farming and manipulating the gut flora, because of course the gut is the site where vast quantities of foreign antigens are coming in every day, the lunch that you're hoping to have in due course, not to mention all these bacteria. And it's a major site.
I'm not having bacteria for lunch, not deliberately anyway.
Well, maybe you should. Maybe you should, because in fact we need to be swallowing a diversity of microbes. But again, we now know that many of the bacteria in the gut are producing molecules that specifically turn on the regulatory pathways in the gut that modulate the activity of regulatory cells versus Th17 cells, one of the more vicious kinds of effector cell for autoimmune disorders and for inflammatory bowel disease. So there are many different ways one's going to be able to attack this problem. And many other parts of the human flora from hunter-gatherer days that haven't really been looked at properly yet. We used to all have organisms in our skin called ammonia-oxidizing bacteria, which are the organisms that use the ammonia and nitrate that human sweat is full of and convert it into nitrite and nitric oxide, which are then absorbed through the skin. These are very potent immunomodulators. It's inconceivable that that wasn't important. And of course, because we don't have those organisms anymore, we smell horrible if we sweat, because different sorts of processes are happening to the nitrate and so on in the sweat. So there are lots of areas like that that simply haven't been explored yet. And we also know that ectoparasites, things like fleas and lice, powerfully influence the immune systems of wild animals. So, but we've lost them. Now, no one's suggesting we should put them back, but obviously we evolved with little syringes walking around all over us, injecting pharmacologically potent molecules that fool around with the immune system, and suddenly they're not there anymore. So we need to work out what they were doing and make use of their properties.
Well, according to the newspapers, the bed bugs are back, and so there might be something good coming out of bed bugs in hotels. This is, it's delightful to think that all that itching is worthwhile. I want to go back to something you said, and you've kind of repeated it a couple of times about the gut microbiota. I do understand we've shed helminths for the most part in the developed world, but has that in itself, does that account for a shift in the rest of the balance of the, it's still a pretty rich microbiota that inhabits the gut, and what other pressures might have been at play as we've made the transition from hunter-gatherer to shop and drop, I don't know, shop and eat.
Shop and drive.
Yes. Well, one of the papers in our session this morning was a superb paper from an Italian group. Dr. Cavalieri presented it, where they have done, using the technologies that have now emerged and make the gut microbiota such an exciting area to work on. I imagine your last session was on that kind of issue, was it? No,
it was on energy production. But
because what they've done is compare the gut microbiota of European children, in fact Italian children, with children in a village in Burkina Faso, where in fact people were living pretty much with the same sorts of utensils, same kind of quick cooking methods and so on as in the Neolithic period. And the gut flora is totally different. There's a greater diversity in the gut flora of the children in Burkina Faso, and totally different balances of different broad groups of organism. And it's been known for a long time that if you take, for instance, and this is work going back to the 1970s, if you take germ-free rats, that is, rats that have been produced so that they have no bacterial flora whatsoever, depending on what you reconstitute their guts with, you can make them more susceptible to developing autoimmune arthritis, or you can make them less susceptible to autoimmune arthritis by putting different organisms in. And animals that don't have a full gut flora, their immune systems not only don't develop properly, but they're extremely susceptible to producing chronic inflammatory responses, because it's particularly the regulatory system that seems to fail to develop. In fact, some of the most elegant work on that has been done by Dennis Kasper and by his ex-postdoc, now an independent worker called Sarkis Mesmanian, who's been working on Bacteroides fragilis, which of course is an organism that everybody has in their gut. But this organism produces a polysaccharide which causes lymphocytes to become regulatory lymphocytes, and also activates and expands that population of regulatory lymphocytes. And at the same time, this molecule seems to be able to turn down the Th17 lymphocytes. So you bias the whole system towards immunoregulation. And they've shown how this is effective in a number of models of chronic inflammation. Sorry, I'm talking too much. I could go on for hours like this.
But again, the colleague that Professor Rooks was mentioning in a wonderful paper, the Burkina Faso children had a diet much higher in fiber, almost non-existent simple sugars, and among other differences, very little meat as a condiment, which we all read about as we try to change our diets, perhaps, and really striking differences. So I think absolutely that the reduction in worm infections, along with these dietary changes, are partly responsible. I'm a student of these things. I read about them. I don't do them, but it was very striking to hear that talk today, put in really clear terms, differences between a really traditional agricultural and gathering diet versus the modern Florentine diet.
Well, I wanted to ask you, as Graham was expounding, I was thinking, is your epidemiologic data, the snapshots you take of the developing world, and you see the increase in diseases that we most of the time associate with developed countries. Can you tease out some of these trends? Do they correspond to what he's talking about in terms of microbiological and immunologic experience? Or are they just, is the data too disperse, I guess, to
Well, it's a very different kind of data.
Of course,
And
yeah.
just to make sure that everyone knows, what I presented today largely comes from a series of ongoing studies by the WHO and
Right.
other groups that provide these global pictures, and they have strengths and they have weaknesses. One of their strengths is that they get broad coverage. One of the weaknesses, there's a lot of assumptions because the quality of the data from Niger or from Sudan is relatively less given the state of their healthcare systems or even the state of civil society. But their strength is in their comparative method. Another weakness is they don't often look in the detailed way of the mechanisms that are, the feature of 99% of the papers at this meeting, or that Graham and some of the other colleagues at our symposium today talked about. But in general, the immunology fits. The decline in infectious diseases results in this lack of what we think is the evolutionary accommodated balance, or the evolutionary adaptive balance that in the lack thereof produces these autoimmune conditions that Graham was talking about. So, and on the non-communicable disease side, the increase in longevity, the changes in physical activity, the changes in diet, the changes in a more demanding way of life, and then the other condition is greater social inequalities, which happen with economic development, whether we like it or not. We don't really know exactly why that happens. The current look of economic development in the world is a capitalism form. It produces inequalities that none of us really like. That is, most scientists recognize them and don't wish to put them under any rug. And those differences create real problems for the political decisions about healthcare systems and who you're going to, are you still going to be trying to get the children to their 5th birthday and get them the vaccines? Or are you going to move towards the upper middle class and the upper class who are tending to have the diseases that most of us have in this room? And so that's a wide answer. But the biological mechanisms are solid for the non-communicable diseases and why, and certainly for the decline in infectious diseases. But there's a gap between the sort of microbiota focus, particularly at this meeting and this vastly developing literature. But it's very interesting because one of the other important factors that people talk about as being responsible for the rise in non-communicable diseases in poor countries is it's very clear now that if you were born small for your birth weight, or you had some period of interrupted growth and development during critical periods, especially the first 2 years of life, you're much greater, higher susceptibility to obesity and to type 2 diabetes and hypertension later on. So we used to think this was just a different face of poverty, but we now understand that there's some probably physiological programming, and really one of the ways in which these two areas come together is around inflammation. Inflammation is being shown as being really critical to how fat cells work. We used to think fat cells were just these passive storage depots. They're not. There's things called adipokines, which in fact some of them are the very things we look at as they're inflammatory cytokines that we used to look at in schistosomiasis or in hookworm or in other things. So inflammation is, I think, coalescing as one of these keystone areas of biological and biomedical science that very mechanistic looks and public health has to pay attention to.
Okay, I was wondering, as you're both talking, can we take a particular syndrome or disease and talk about it in these explicit terms? That is, maybe multiple sclerosis or asthma. Can you talk about it in the context of these bigger trends? For example, does multiple sclerosis or asthma start to show up in underdeveloped countries as along with all the other sort of middle-aged diseases?
Okay, that's a good way to put the question. You showed a wonderful slide today, so.
Yeah, well, the answer is absolutely yes.
Absolutely yes.
And of course, some of these disorders, like inflammatory bowel disease, virtually didn't exist. You know, and it's not really that nobody knew how to recognize them. Well, they're very obvious and characteristic things, but the first cases of these disorders in Europe started to be spotted around 1900. But it's a very dramatic effect already, and already in the developing countries, as people start to urbanize, you start to see these diseases increasing in frequency. And so in a way, there's a sort of urgency about understanding all of this, because we're now living with these remarkably high incidences and still increasing incidences of things like type 1 diabetes, ulcerative colitis, multiple sclerosis, inflammatory bowel disease. But the developing countries are about to hit the same thing. So we're going to get rid of their infections, we're going to alter their exposure to the old friends, because some of the organisms we're talking about are not strictly speaking infections, they're things that were part of the environment in which we evolved. Some of them harmless things in the environment. But we're going to alter all of that, and they're suddenly going to start having the same disease patterns we have here. Whereas with a little bit of luck, if we can work out what the molecular pathways are that enable the old friends to stop the immune system from becoming trigger happy and attacking things it shouldn't attack, then maybe we can help developing countries not to get into the same mess we've got ourselves into.
But the sort of agents that we have at our disposal now, for example, steroidal drugs that tamp down the inflammatory response, are not a particular, they're not all that successful. I take it that we need a more, I mean, you're going to have a tough time convincing someone, I guess, that rather than have a steroid, they should have a worm or a worm concoction as a treatment until you boil it down to the essence, I guess.
Well, I mean, there are two parts to answering that question. Firstly, I think if you have severe Crohn's disease or progressive multiple sclerosis, you will do anything. You'll swallow worms, no problem. I mean, even if you're Jewish and these are pig worms, you're still going to swallow worms. So, but on the other hand, the truth of the matter is that once the principle is proven that you can actually restore the regulation of the immune system with these agents, then of course people will start pumping huge amounts of money into isolating the relevant molecules. So I don't seriously think we're going to start going backwards and putting back all these infections. That isn't the answer, but it is a necessary stage to go through. Prove the principle and then find the molecules.
Yeah, and apropos your metaphor, think back to the early days of vaccination, right? People were saying, I'm going to take something from the cow bacillus, well, that
right. Yep.
obviously turned into the most successful and frankly the only disease eradication program we can wave the flag about, smallpox. So obviously that's a different microorganism, a much simpler biology to then develop a very successful vaccination. So, I mean, the notion of looking at these forms, these antigens that stimulate, turn off, provide balance, or in their lack, allow for an imbalance to occur, I think that is where we have to go for this particular condition. No one's saying we want children under 5 we want half of children under 5 to die of these infections.
Sure.
It's just that there's a cost. There's a cost to what we did.
All right. Are there any questions in the room or from the internet? No. Oh, we do have a question. Okay.
I'm Charlotte Smith. I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley School of Public Health and also a person with multiple sclerosis, so I'm very much interested in your work, although my research area is very different. But there is somewhat of a genetic component that's been shown also that is the alleles that predispose someone to MS are absent in some of the same populations that you're talking about in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where, so what I'm wondering actually where this is leading is if there is in fact still a genetic component, would that then negate the hypothesis of this microbial component or microbial enhancement of the immune system, do you think, or will they be linked or separated? Do you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely, but I think the whole question of genetics in relation to these diseases is absolutely fascinating, and it fits wonderfully. The best example to give, rather than multiple sclerosis, on which I have never worked, I don't really know very much about it, is inflammatory bowel disease. Because there's been a recent study of those parts of the world where there are the highest levels of what we would call the old friends, highest levels of worm infections and exposure to the organisms from our past. And it turns out that you get selection in those populations of partially compensatory single nucleotide polymorphism. So you have people who are producing slightly higher levels of all the pro-inflammatory cytokines in order to partially overcome the immunosuppression being caused by the helminths. It makes sense, doesn't it? So you get accumulation of these SNPs. But the problem is that balance is now re-established. But what happens when the worms go? And it turns out that in a wonderful paper by Fumagalli et al., it was in Journal Experimental Medicine, very respectable, in 2009, I think. What they find is that the SNP that accumulate in these populations are the very same ones that have been identified as genetic risk factors for inflammatory bowel disease. In other words, you see the whole thing unfolding before you, and you can see how the genetics fit in. So the fact there's a gene for something may mean that this was a gene that wasn't doing anything harmful until the old friends were taken away.
Which is reminiscent of the thrifty genotype idea, right? Which people use to account partially for, obesity and insulin resistance.
Fascinating. Well, gentlemen, I think we've run over our time here, and we should be wrapping up. But I'll give you a chance to, in a very succinct way, I love the way they do it on radio, very quickly, if you could summarize or have a final thought to share with the people who are watching.
I think that the diseases of so-called modernity and affluence are in fact not just the diseases of modernity and affluence. They're the diseases of poor people now because the way people live is different in our globalized world.
Graham?
Well, I think this whole topic is in an enormously exciting moment because it is all beginning to come together. And perhaps the last remark I would like to make is that an area where we now realize that this story is important is in a certain subset of people with depression, which interestingly the epidemiology is now beginning to show that this may be the greatest health problem in the world in a way in terms of lost active life. Because it turns out that these chronic pro-inflammatory mediators actually will drive a syndrome that looks exactly like depression, probably is depression, and there's a large subset of people who are depressed and who have chronically raised levels of these pro-inflammatory mediators. This is extraordinarily exciting because it raises the possibility it might be possible to vaccinate against depression, use immunoregulatory mechanisms to combat that particular form of depression, and this would be revolutionary. And we've just written all about that in the Archives of General Psychiatry, so if anyone's interested.
That's an uplifting, undepressing final thought to share. I like that. That was from Graham Rook of University College London, and my other guest here is Steve McGarvey of Brown University. This is it for ASM Live for 2011. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.